أهلا وسهلا بالجميع and welcome to Psychic Militancy. As you know, folks, this is new and we're just getting started. So do the things that Sina, my producer, has told me to tell you all to do. Subscribe, like, become a Patreon supporter. Let us continue to produce this in the way that we want and be able to have these public-facing conversations that feel so important right now, especially keep us focused, keep us militant, hence the Psychic Militancy. I'm so excited today to have one of my favorite people in the entire world join us.
Oh, you're
Truly,
so
I
sweet.
mean, he's the most generous person. Like from the first day I met you, you're just so generous and so loving and so aligned. And so when I was thinking through who would I want to have, definitely in the first like couple weeks of this, Diana was on the top of my list. So this is Diana
No,
Buttu, everybody. Um, I feel like you don't even need an introduction, but what I've been doing with guests is having them sort of introduce themselves in a way that's not just like khashabi or like, stale. So just to locate us, and then I have a lot of things that we could get into that have to do with the ways in which you have shown me a method of remaining aligned and psychically militant around things that can be very complex and coerce people into compromises, which I've not seen you do in the ways that a lot of people do in your position. So we're going to get into that. But first, why don't you just introduce yourself to our audience and how you find yourself here with me?
okay. Well, first, Lara, you're more than generous because, I mean, that's a very kind introduction. And I want to say the same goes back to you. The first time we met, there was an instant connection, and the connection hasn't stopped. And I'm so grateful for that. You're pure, you're real, you're genuine, you're loving, and there's just something really real about you, which is rare to find these days. Who am I? I don't know who I am. I think it depends on what time of day you're asking and where you're asking. So the basic is that I'm a mom. I'm a mother to an 11-year-old boy. He's an energetic, genuine, smart boy who is politically savvy. And so that has meant that I've needed to be energetic and politically savvy. I'm not so sure I'm as smart as he is. Palestinian. We live in Haifa. But I wasn't born in Haifa. I wasn't raised in Haifa. I was born in Canada and raised in Canada. And, and the only reason that that's important is because I come to Palestine with a slightly different lens, which is seeing it somewhat as an outsider, even though I'm an insider at the same time. Mm-hmm. I'm a lawyer. I work a lot with media. I try to educate a lot of journalists about what's going on here, and I'm an educator. That's it. That's me.
I love that. And it is you. And it is you. And I know that's a hard question for some folks. And this is like such a therapist in me to bring me in and be like, okay, now you talk about yourself. But I love that you led with your son, who I've had the opportunity to meet. And this is not just mom talking about, you know how much I love your kid and how, it was to see him also in Palestine, right? Like I met him in Palestine, and to see him growing up in Palestine and what that means. And also that you're a lawyer, and you're not, I think folks might know you through the media that you're doing, through the piercing analysis that you have. I think this is one of the things why I felt it was so important to bring you on, like the level of analysis that you provide us, which is both technical and meticulous, but also doesn't forget the structural. And I think for me, that's the most important piece when we think about the ways in which these systems, and particularly this pernicious form of Zionism right now over the past 2 years and the joining of global forces around it, there's a way in which I've really started to uncover all the methods in which it is meant to take us off course and being able to commute between what's the technical that's actually happening and then the larger structural. And I think your analysis does that all the time. And just for folks, I mean, Diana said she's a lawyer, but she's a former advisor to the negotiating team of the PLO. So I think also the internal knowledge that you have over a quarter century, it's been a long time for you seeing this. So I want to place us right there and just sort of talk about what's it like for you to have had that longue durée, especially in this moment when we're thinking about this commuting piece between the mechanics and the structural.
You know, I don't know where to begin in all of this. So I moved to Palestine in September of 2000. So it was 25 years ago, quarter of a century. And I wasn't the same person as I am today. I don't think any person 25 years after the fact is the same person, but I am a totally different person than I was 25 years ago. And when I first moved here to Palestine, I moved to Palestine under the guise, or as coming in as somebody who was going to be, as you put it, a legal advisor to the PLO. And my work as a legal advisor was primarily with mostly, let's say, or not, lots, let's say, with the Palestinian negotiating team. But it wasn't exclusively. That wasn't the only work that I did. There was lots of other work that I was involved in. But when I arrived, it was the start of the second Intifada. I literally arrived the day that the Intifada started. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because when I arrived into a place where everything was unraveling. And by everything, it's everything that I knew was unraveling, which is to say that I was seeing, I had been sold this false bill of goods that many of us had been sold during the 90s, which was that there was going to be a Palestinian state, Palestinians were going to be free, that the occupation was going to be over, Israel's going to finally end the occupation, there was going to be a change. Like, this was the bill of goods that I was sold. And when I arrived, it's the immediate test to that bill of goods. And what I end up seeing instead is that while I'm in Palestine and while every single diplomat, and I'm working largely with diplomats, there was some interaction with the Israelis because it was required to be, but most of my work involved working with diplomats. With every single, and when I say every, I literally mean every single meeting, there was always, it always either began or the middle or the end had it in it, this idea that we believe in the two-state solution. This is what every single diplomat told me, each and every one of them. And so there was this major disconnect for me that they were all talking about how they believed in the two-state solution. And yet, if you just looked outside your window, you could see a couple of things. One is you could see settlements going up really quickly. Yep. And you see the violence of the occupation. And the fact that that all of these diplomats are willing to do nothing about it. So fast forward now to, let's say, 2023, or now 2024, and then 2025, and you see the exact same you hear the exact same doublespeak, where they keep talking about how important it is for Palestinians to have their freedom. Sometimes they don't say it in those words. But then they're at the same time coddling a society and a state that's genocidal. And I don't just mean a state, it's also a society that is genocidal. Yeah. And they're punishing the victims of that genocide being Palestinians. And so you see that same history repeating itself over and over and over again. And so when you ask the question of situate yourself, this is where I find myself not just situated, but I look back, and when you ask me, to describe myself, the reason I describe myself first as a mother is not just because of my son, who's obviously very important, but also because of the history that carries, that I'm the daughter of two people who survived the Nakba. And my late father, was the same age as my son was. He was 9 years old during the Nakba, when he was ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And my son was 9 years old when Israel began this latest genocide. And you can see the similarities, like you see them and you feel them, and you see them and you feel them. And I often feel as though I'm screaming into the wind, that because if I see it, then everybody can see it. Why isn't anybody doing anything about it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of what you're describing is like the infrastructure that allows people the escape valve to not see it has been a long time coming.
Yes.
Right. And has been meticulously constructed such that people can look away under the guise of them being good.
Yes.
Right. So I'm really appreciative that you're bringing in this sort of connection, like under settler colonialism, how time also collapses in many ways. And I think for a long time, for Palestinians, it was the story of the grandparents or the parents in your case who are telling the story of the Nakba. And what the genocide in Gaza does is collapse that. And it's no longer hearing the stories and just holding on to a key, which has its importance, of course, and we understand the political resonance of that and how it's been central to keeping the centrality of the fight for Palestinian liberation across the board, right? Not just liberating certain spaces, but Palestine in general. But now you have an entire generation that's no longer having to listen to the stories of their grandparents. It's them, right? Yeah. And yet that infrastructure that has been built, the one you're describing, is one that insists that it's still something of the past, even as it's accelerating the ethnic cleansing into the future.
Yeah. And also the other problem with it is, as you said, time collapses. Not only does time collapse, but it's as though time doesn't exist, and that everything can be undone. So all harm can be undone. That's the part that has been such it's been just so gut wrenching over the course of the past, not just 2 years, the past 2 years in particular, but the past 25 years. And for me, it's because I spend so much time with people, that these diplomats, these leaders, none of them spend time with people. So or journalists, none of them. So you hear a diplomat, I often used to hear diplomats say, "Oh, don't worry about whatever. Don't worry about the wall being built. It'll come down when there's a Palestinian state." And it's like, well, how fanciful for you to say that. How wonderful for you to say that. But in the meantime, there's some real harm. Or don't worry about this village that's been destroyed. Don't worry, when there's a Palestinian state, then it'll all be compensated. But in the meantime, people have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their family members, their memories, their everything. And when I would talk to them about Palestinian political prisoners, "Oh, don't worry, Diana, it'll all be undone with a Palestinian state." But how do you erase the scars of torture with a Palestinian state? A Palestinian state doesn't erase the scars of torture. And so all of this has been, and then, fast forward now to the past 2 years with these false promises of aspirations for a Palestinian state, or whatever they're calling it these days. It's the same thing. Like every person I know in Gaza has either had family members killed, injured, their homes destroyed, or that's it. There's no other. In fact, I'm trying to think if anybody doesn't fall into that category, and the answer is no. Everybody's had somebody either be killed, be injured, or had their family home destroyed.
Right. You have a piece in The Guardian, which I'm going to put in the show notes, called "The Magic Pill." And I think that gets into this. But one of the things that I want to highlight for folks, and part of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, is like, there's these things that we know viscerally. And then part of the infrastructure we're talking about are all the ways in which we are taken off course in which we get confused even when we're sure about things. The ways in which power works together, soft power, brute power, whatever thing works together to make us feel like somehow we're being unreasonable, even when we know we're not. And that's kind of what you're describing here. Our dear comrade, Dylan Rodriguez, talks about lexical warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like he describes it as a theater that is meant to basically recircumscribe the parameters of what we're even allowed to consider. And it's done lexically through words. But what you're saying is that part of that is also displacing the material impact that has already happened. So even in the deferred promise is already one that's predicated on intense loss and a subjugation of Palestinians. Like this is not even the second we get to the lexical warfare part, there's already been so much that's been ceded.
Yes, and you're supposed to be happy when a cookie is dangled in front of you. That's the part that is so dehumanizing, is that they dangle this little cookie in front of you saying, oh, look, if you're good and if you behave well, you might just get this so-called Palestinian state, without ever describing what it actually means. But the part to get to that, and the warfare to get to that, as you put it, is so dehumanizing, because it erases and ignores all of the harm that Israel's created, and it gives Israel a pass. Like, oh, look at Israel, you finally did something that you should have never done in the first place by giving them a part of the land back that you should never have stolen in the first place. And because you've done something, you're only giving part, a little bit of back of the land, we're going to applaud you, and we're going to ignore all of the harm that you've caused. And you Palestinians should not be complaining about it, because if you complain about it, well, then you're just backwards and stupid.
Yeah.
And spoilers.
Yeah.
And it's and that, who are you? Yeah. And who are, and it's that lexicon, there's also the lexicon that's used that's violent in and of itself. Yeah. So it's a lexicon that is meant to be confusing. It's a lexicon that's meant to be, that's created in a way that if you veer away from this lexicon, then somehow, again, there's something wrong with you. So if you veer away from this language of two-state solution, well, there's something wrong with you. It's not there's something wrong with the whole language of two-state solution in the context of settler colonialism. There's something wrong with you, like you demanding your rights, you demanding your land back, you demanding reparations, you demanding that you be able to return. There's something wrong with you, because they've created an entirely new framework. And if you don't fit within that framework, there's something wrong with you.
Right. And it's a way to cause wear and tear on refusals, which are the centerpiece, I think, when we're thinking about the ways in which Palestinian or Lebanese have been able to persist in their demands, their very basic demands for self-determination and to push up against settler colonialism and its frameworks. That idea of making you feel like you're doing something wrong, that you're the one who's being unreasonable, those are the both subtle and very violent, like you said, mechanics of the wear and tear. Because I imagine there's been a price to pay for you to be the person in the room that's just like, hold up, guys, like, what are you even talking about? I don't imagine that goes off easily without even bringing gender into the room or Palestinianness, and just being the person.
Oh, where do we begin?
I see reality. I'm reality testing. Like you're always the one asked to do that.
Yes. Yeah. And there's so many components to it, Lotta, like I don't even know if we're going to get into the gender part of it, or the age, or all of this, right? There's just so much of it. But yes, being the as some would put it, the naysayer, the person who's saying no, is you do pay a price for it. You pay a price. You pay a price because I don't even know where to begin. Like at times I was ridiculed. At times I was labeled the spoiler. At times I was labeled the obstinate one, the unrealistic one. I was, cast aside as being the like kind of the outcast, right? Like the unreasonable one. And the amazing thing was that for all of this unreasonableness that
Mm-hmm.
people were throwing on me or casting on me, it was actually not only were my viewpoints were correct, like in terms of
Yeah.
legally and etc., but they reflected very much what people were saying, what Palestinians were saying, both inside Palestine and in all parts of Palestine, by the way, and outside of Palestine. And so there's I guess I should describe it for you, so that maybe
please.
listeners can make sense of it. But during the period that I was involved in the negotiations, there were different levels of negotiations. So there were sometimes negotiations directly with the Israelis, and sometimes there were negotiations with the Europeans, and sometimes there were with the Americans. It was rarely the case that we had kind of everybody in the room, very rarely. And I'll describe those times where there were some where that was the case. But no matter which one of those three that was happening, right, with the Israelis or with the Americans or with the Europeans, there was a framework that they created, meaning that the Americans, the Israelis, and the Europeans created, and that somehow we, the Palestinians, had to buy into. And if we didn't buy into it, then we were seen as unreasonable. And let me be clear, there were many Palestinians who did buy into it. These were Palestinians in the Palestinian leadership who did buy into it. I won't name names, but there were some who really did like get into it because either it was because they wanted to remain relevant or they thought that this was the most practical way. I don't know what their motivations were, but there were people who bought into this system. And so in any of the meetings, negotiation, whatever you call it, if you were the person who was being the naysayer, right? The person who's refusing, who's insisting, who's impressing, who's saying this isn't the way that it should work. It ended up being that I was the person who was labeled as somehow being off. It's not that their framework was off. It was that I was off. And so, so they couldn't explain anything that was happening in Palestine, except to say that all of these people who thought the same way that I did were somehow off. They were the ones who were the rejectionists. We were the ones who were on the wrong side of history, like all to say that they never questioned their framework. They never questioned the ideology. They never questioned that settler colonialism is wrong. It was always that we, the people like me, were wrong for saying, well, why should a settlement remain? Or we were the ones who were wrong for whether you believe in two states or one state, Laura. It doesn't, in either case, right? Or, right. Or if, for example, one set of negotiations, a long time, was over what they called the borders. And what borders really meant was, how is it that we are going to accommodate these Israeli settlements into a greater Israel? Like, we're not going to evacuate these settlements. We're going to, quote unquote, accommodate them, meaning that Palestinians have to give up more territory to accommodate the illegal wrong that Israel has created, being settlements. And so at every instance, whenever I said, well, why is this the case? Like, why do we have to compromise more? Why can't these people you move them in? Why can't you move them out? It's just, I can get you the moving trucks. I know lots of companies. The response, I mean, that was the fight, but their response was always like looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Don't you understand realpolitik? And I would say, well, yeah, I do. I do understand it. I actually do understand politics. And so can you explain to me how it is that in the late 1800s, a Viennese man was sitting in a Viennese cafe, sipping some Viennese coffee, and decided that he was going to take over Palestine And you all
Right.
turned to him and you didn't say that that was crazy and unreasonable, being Herzl, Theodor Herzl.
Yep.
How is it that that is less crazy than me saying, give the land back to the very owners that are living just, 5 kilometers away from the land that they own? Please tell me where the craziness is. And so all of this is to say that so the ways in which that in particular me had to bear it was I was the only woman for many, many, many of those sessions, many of them, not all, but many of them. I was definitely the youngest. I was the, as I said, I was the only person who was coming from outside. And so didn't, so it was all meant to make me be the crazy one rather than them questioning their crazy idea of both a 2-state solution and their crazy idea of accommodating Israel.
Yes. Yes. And, none of that is accidental. It's meant to, the way that it plays out relationally and in these things, it's meant to look like this is a natural, organic, unfolding thing where like you're bringing something so alien to the picture. And how are you even thinking about this? Now, again, it hides in gender. Like, oh, I imagine there was a feeling of like, oh, you dumb little girl, you're coming here.
Yes, they would pat on the head.
Exactly. You have all these,
how cute,
huge ideas. Exactly. Oh, but this is the thing, one of the things I've been exploring and it's in my forthcoming book, I talk about how realpolitik and pragmatism actually hides and is able to mobilize particular forms of fascism because it actually relies on us then internalizing that crazy making feeling because of course, liberal humanism, all these myths around dialogue actually being how we get to things. Of course, the specter of negotiation in the context of Palestine is front and center, and all the ways in which it's mobilized to hide the actual violence that's behind it. Because part of what you're saying is one of the things it asks us to do is to join in the fantasy that under the condition of settler colonialism, anything other than theft, plunder, extraction, coercion, domination could be possible.
Yes.
Right? And that the second you become the person who refuses that, you're infusing reality in such a way that everything falls apart. And so everybody involved is involved in sort of stabilizing this myth, this magic pill that you've talked about at your expense. And it becomes very difficult to sustain that when you're the only person, even when you deeply know that. So you and I have talked a lot, and I don't think I've heard it in this texture, how you're describing it. So what are the things that you would do and maybe still do to like remain in your body, remain focused on the condition? Because you're describing a condition. Like how, I think this is what people are struggling with. In the face of everything we see, so many people will say to me, I feel like I'm the one who's crazy. And so this has been my process of like, let's track this. Like, what are the mechanics psychically that are happening? But more importantly for me is, what are we doing to stop that intrusion from taking hold? And then you walk away being like, you know what? I am the one that's crazy. Like, you have not gotten there over all these years. You're just like, nope, I was right from the beginning. And it's true. It's not like self-aggrandizement. It's just like, you had the pulse on reality, material reality, connectedness to the land, connectedness to people. But like, how do you stay there?
So there's a couple of things. You're going to love this. I think of all people, you're going to love this. There's a few things that I do. So one, I'm not always sure that I am not losing my mind, by the way. I don't think like, I don't think that it's sometimes I do and think, well, why is this happening? Or why, or maybe that, I've never thought maybe they're right, but there are times where I do a questioning myself. And it's not that I've always been right, by the way. It's just that I spend a lot of time listening. I think that's if there's anything that I've done over time well, is that I listen. I listen to people. So what do I do to kind of preserve myself, I guess is the question. A few things. One is Charlie Brown. Do you remember the teacher in Charlie Brown? That wah, 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 wah. So that's kind of what I hear a lot of times. Because I know it. I can say it by heart right now, right? I know exactly what they're going to say. But the other thing I do, which is weird, is I write everything they say down. So it's like in my ear, I'm hearing, like in my mind, I'm hearing a wah, 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 but I'm actually writing down what they're saying. So that is not, so I'm having a little bit of a disconnect. And then at the end of my meeting, I'll look down and I'm like, oh, is that what they said? But it's exactly what I heard the wah wah in my head, right? It's not like there was anything new. But just so that sometimes I have to look back just to check my notes, but it's pretty much always the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of like, wah, 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 wah. But the other thing I wanted to tell you, Laura, which adds to the point that you were making, is what freaks people out, what freaks this group of quote unquote powerful people out the most is when you bring in the person into the room.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if there was ever a time where I brought in my own personal circumstances or the circumstances of other people who were in the room, like some of the other negotiators, or if I brought in stories from people, like the lived reality of other people, suddenly it became too much for these primarily men to handle. So I'll give you an example. So if I ever mentioned that my father became a refugee at age 9, and even if I just mentioned just a little bit of it, it was like, whoa, no, this is too much, because now they had to put a face to refugee. It's no longer just this blob of people that they've always thought about. They now have somebody sitting across from them.
In this example, when you say they, you're talking about like the Americans, the Europeans, even sometimes the Israelis.
Yes. Uh-huh. And then similarly, if I talked about, there were people on the negotiating team who had spent years in prison and who had been tortured. And if I ever mentioned them, and these were some of the ones that were quote unquote lighter, right? If I ever brought them into the room, whoa, like in terms of talking about them, it was again like, oh, no, you can't, because they liked the image of the reformed Palestinian, the Palestinian who went from being somebody who was fighting for their rights, thrown in prison for their political beliefs, or for beyond that, to suddenly being, quote unquote, reformed. And if I brought up anything about, and they all went through torture, it's important for people to keep in mind that those Palestinians who were part of the negotiating team who were in prison, they were tortured. And it's like, it's important for us to demonize the system of negotiations. But it's also important, at least for me, to humanize some of the people who were part of that system, because it's important for me to understand where they came from and what their thought process. I might not agree with it, but I do know that that some of them, or that all of them, all the ones who were thrown in prison, all of them were tortured, every last one of them. And so if I brought that up, that was like, whoa. If I brought up anything to do with any lived realities of any Palestinian, whether that person was had the Israelis demolished their home, killed a member of their family, or anything, that was just way too much. It was way too much for any of these like powerful people to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Right. Oh, I have so many thoughts on that. You're right. I do like these examples, and you were spot on about that. But, one of the things is what you're saying is not only do they then have to contend with the reality. One of the things I have a dear comrade and psychoanalyst, Yasser Arafat, who talks about the ways in which when you stop working for repair in these sorts of relationships, her language around this, I'm paraphrasing here, is you stand to rearrange the direction in which the relationship then proceeds or doesn't proceed. Wow. So part of it is when you're in your refusal, when you're naming reality, when you refuse the seduction of repair that you already know is a sham, because it's built on all these conditioned positions that have to do with legibility, that have to do with leaving behind Palestine, your claim to Palestine, politics, the fact that you're Palestinian, like you have to be like Arab, all the ways in which fundamentally self-effacement is a part of this already questions the premise from which from which the departure is. And you know that. The act of engaging in the refusal in real time really pushes upon this process that they rely on. They rely on us engaging in that under the myth and the lie and the innocence that this is just normative. And the second you break through that, you're right, they can't, not only they can't handle it, but I've seen it firsthand. They have a psychic collapse.
Absolutely.
They can't keep it together.
Absolutely. They cannot keep it together. There was a time, I don't think I've ever spoken about this. I've certainly not spoken about what I just told you about to anybody, but there's another thing I don't think I've ever spoken to anybody about, like on an interview, friends only, but not in an interview, which is back in, I think the year was 2001. Yeah, it was 2001 to mid 2002. So to situate the period, the major negotiation happened in the year 2000, July of 2000, that was called Camp David negotiation with President Clinton. And then the Intifada starts in September of 2000, with Ariel Sharon when he goes onto the Haram Sharif. He goes on purpose with 1,000 police officers. And sorry, not police officers, army and police officers. Anyway, then so the Intifada begins. Taba, there were a series of negotiations, and then Taba happens in January of 2001. And then Ariel Sharon gets elected to be prime minister in February of 2001. And then everything collapses. Ariel Sharon says, I'm not going to engage in negotiations. I'm not going to be involved in anything. And so in the immediate aftermath of February of 2001, the PLO comes up with this idea. A colleague of mine actually says, we need to reach out and speak directly to Israelis. Crazy idea. And so we start this program in which we just start speaking to Israelis, but at their invitation. So we get invited by Israeli NGOs. We get this, by the way, this is all before BDS, like before the official launch of BDS. We get invited by Israeli NGOs to go and speak to like people within their communities. We get invited by student groups. We get invited to communities, like all of the sort of crazy stuff. My colleague and I get invited all sorts of places. And we do hundreds of these things, hundreds of these talks. And for each of the talks that we gave, it was always the same structure about talking about what it was like to live under occupation, what happened at Camp David, like just to get them to understand, because they don't have a free press here. It's a censored press. And so the naivete was that, if they just listen to us, then, they'll understand. Well, one of the things that my colleague was always saying was never bring in the personal, never bring it, like never make it personal, which was very bizarre to me. I was like, well, why wouldn't I make it personal? And so the few times that I actually did make it personal, where I talked about me, or I talked about my friends, or I talked about people I knew and what was happening through them, this is where you saw the meltdown that you were talking about. Like they would actually have a meltdown. Some people threw things at me. One guy spat at me, actually spat at me, swore, like just crazy meltdowns because, well, but for me, I felt it was because they couldn't grasp us as humans. They couldn't grasp that the person that was before them wasn't deserving of their disgust. And so they had to make it that I had clearly done something wrong. And so there was a whole set of like, and they couldn't grasp that an Israeli would be so cruel, so mean, so, so everything. It was just, it was a complete and total meltdown for them.
Yeah. 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 Man, I've seen it and I've started to track it. Like there's a pleasure in sort of knowing the mechanics of what happens. But part of what you're sort of bringing to us, Diana, and I so appreciate you going to places that you haven't discussed publicly before, is that we know that this did not begin in 2023, October 2023.
Of course not.
But it bears repeating, because I think one of the things that this type of infrastructure does when so many people are involved in it, nation states, so-called good people, liberals, fascists alike, is that the repetition of violence makes it such that it sucks all the air out in the room. So sometimes I think we get lost and think these are platitudes, like everybody should know this. But the repetition for me needs to be just as ferocious as their repetition. Yeah. And so you bringing us back to this and saying, this was 25 years ago. These are the conversations we're having, so that we can look to now and understand there is no other possibility than what we are seeing right now if it continues. Like one of the lines you say in this piece, this magic pill, you said, rhetoric without consequence has been the West modus operandi for decades. The cost has been catastrophic. And this is, I remembered that, I mean, I highlighted that line, but what you're saying right now is like, if we track this, if we track both in terms of how this was built into the structure, I mean, settler colonialism relies on the denial of reality. You have to every day commit yourself to disavowing reality, which is part of, like, I love that you said naivete, but it's also good faith. And I think it's important for us to say that is like, I've heard from so many Palestinians from that period of time, and Lebanese and all of it is like, part of how power works is relies on the good faith of people, particularly people who are politically aligned, to say, I'm actually committed to a way out of this, but they have no intention actually of changing anything structural, right? So then you end up being feeling like you're the fool that's naive, but it's like, I'm actually engaged in good faith, but part of that good faith, like what it's predatory on, it's predatory grammar, psychic grammar that relies on us mistaking like we think it's ignorance rather than ideology.
Right.
And they're ideologically committed to an ideology of Zionism that in and of itself is supremacist, annihilatory, and eliminatory and expansionist. So when they're confronted with a contradiction in that ideology, that's why the meltdown happens. They're just like, it's like, you short circuit. and the same thing, I've had people yell at me. I've had people threaten to kill me. Oh. I mean, the swiftness with which it moves is also our clue, because there's no stamina. There's no stamina, because when you live in a world in which like diplomats from all over the world are shoring up your reality at the expense of actual material reality, where do you build stamina for anything to withstand any sort of reality testing?
Yeah. I don't even know what to say. I mean, first I'm sorry to hear that you get the death threats and all that. I'm not surprised. Yeah. It's, I have a file in my, which I have labeled love letters, which one day I will go through it and
reenact them in real time. You and me, we can read them back and forth.
Yes, I will do that one day with like, I forgot what the TV show was where they would read over the tweets or something. I'll do that one day. Yeah, I'm sorry that you received them, but I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised, right? Because there is absolutely a short circuit there that happens. It's a complete short circuit. Interestingly, now that short circuit isn't happening. Interestingly, now it's turned into a sign of strength. So I'm going to try to situate it so that you can understand it from the perspective of people who I know who live here and some of the conversations that I've had. So some of the conversations that I've had, one woman I know in particular, she describes herself as left wing. You know, they all do. She describes herself as left wing, but then there's always a but, right? But whatever, like, and there's many buts. So-called left wing, so much so that she says to me, you know, I even voted Meretz, like I'm supposed to. Meretz, for those who don't know, is like a Zionist party, right? And so that's supposed to be maybe like, oh, congratulations, I love you. Anyway, so she tells me that she's left wing, and I actually wrote about this. So she at the beginning of, I think it was February of 2024. So we're talking about 4 months into the genocide. She puts a sticker on the back of her car, a bumper sticker. And there were two of them. One of them said, the people of Israel live, Am Israel Hai, which is like, people of Israel live. It's like a show of strength for them. And then the second one was a bumper sticker that reads, together, it was in Hebrew as well. It reads, together we will succeed. And so I asked her, I don't know why I did this, but I asked her, it's like a glutton for punishment, but I said to her, what's with the bumper stickers? And she said, she starts translating it for me. I said, no, I understand what they mean, but this one says, together we will succeed. What's the together? So she does this. She says, together, you, me. I said, no, there's no together. And then I said, and what does success look like?
Yeah.
And she says, we will win. I said, what does win look like? Like, you're just describing, but you're not telling me what success looks like. You're using another word to describe it. She said, when we finish Hamas. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, when there's none left. I said, but I'm not understanding. And I said, is that the equivalent of finishing Likud? Like, what does finishing Likud look like? She says, you can never finish Likud. I said, same thing. So how come you can't finish? I'm trying to get it to her to understand in the simple terms that Hamas is a party, not an ideology, because she can't get that. Yeah. She can't get it. So, by the way, she's a therapist, PhD therapist.
Of course she is.
I forgot to tell you the best part. Anyway, so she can't, she's not understanding. And then at that point, I said, like, there's 10,000 kids that Israel's killed. And she looks at me and she does this. She goes, that's the price. If you have a problem, take it up with the Hamas complaints department. All right. And the conversation kind of went on a little bit longer, and I said, but what about the TikToks and the videos? She says, boys will be boys. Like, and again, this is a therapist. So by the TikToks, you know which ones I'm talking about, the lingerie, yes. The gender reveal, the save the dates, the blowing up the schools, the blowing up the university, all of the war crimes that you've seen, the smashing the kitchens, all of that stuff. And her response was, boys will be boys. Fast forward. And now she's at the point where she feels like, just a couple of months ago, she was at the point where she felt it was kind of crossed the line, and maybe it was a little too much. Just maybe.
Mm-hmm. Was it the 600,000 mark that did it?
Yeah, exactly. It was back in September, like, it was actually, the mark was when she started to see that the world had turned against Israelis. That was when it was like, maybe it's a little bit too much. But that being said, the same thing that maybe made her would have made her wince 5 and 10 years ago, today for her and for all the other people I know who are like her is now a show of strength. Like, see, now Hamas will know not to mess with us. People will know not to mess with us. And at one point, I actually said this to her. I said, do you really think that shooting kids in the head is a way of showing your strength? Because that's what it is for them. That their strength comes from them showing the world that they can shoot a baby in the head, a kid in the head. Because that's what they're doing right now. So what used to be would make them go screaming and crying and all this sort of stuff that you had before, today is very much a show of strength. It's like, this is who we are. And you don't like it too bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's much more honest.
Yeah.
Because it's settler colonialism and the idea, which is the ideology of Zionism, to a T, without the guise or the investment in that liberal innocence.
Exactly.
I mean, you and I have always known how liberal Zionists are. It's the reason why it's a liberal and Zionism, or leftist and Zionism, are fundamentally irreconcilable positions.
Exactly.
Because you can't believe in Zionism or in the construction of the state of Israel on top of Palestinian land and just kind of be like half-assed about it and think that that's not an annihilatory, ideology that you're thinking about. But I want to return to something you said. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. And maybe this is the therapist in me or somebody who's been like obsessing about psychology, but I want to offer something else. I mean, it might feel like that. I have heard people refer to that. I've actually heard, like, for example, Rana Shashibi talking about the same thing around, the Oslo Accords and all of that, like going to these same similar things that you were talking about. Yeah. And then realizing she has this wonderful line that actually makes it into our book, even in my book, where she was just like, then you realize you're a masochist and you're just like doing this to yourself and you feel empty and cheapened, right? But what I hear you describing, and I think this is really important for people, is that number one, I think you get it right away, right? Like there's no fantasy here about who she is or where she's going to end up. But one of the things that people who are invested in this sort of ideology, and certainly abuse, expects is to be able to happen and unfold without us naming and tracking the process that is happening. And what I hear you describing to me as part of a practice of refusal is forcing this rearrangement of the relationship where she must confess. It's such that, like, Zionists have always, this is part of what you taught, have always had, just like anybody who's in power, has always had the benefit of innocence. Fanon talked about this, about like the racial allocation of guilt, where it's always the colonized who assumes all the guilt. And in you kind of pushing and really making her put words to it, what you are also doing is making sure that this position cannot go on without being contested, without her confessing to the actual mechanics of it, which she ends up. I mean, it's genocidal. What she's saying is genocidal. I don't give a who you are dealing with. You saying, wipe them off the face of the earth is a genocidal statement. Let alone what you're saying. We had Ghassan Abu Sitta on and talking about the ways in which the targeting of children and healthcare workers and all that are a fundamental piece of this, not an accidental thing. So rather than just the glutton for punishment, what does it mean for those of us who have the space, and sometimes we don't? And I know there have probably been moments where you're like, the last thing I want to do is have this conversation. But what does it mean for us to push on those themes in the time that we can and make them be responsible not only for the words, but the actions and the positions that Zionism requires of them?
Yeah, I have to say I'm fortunate, Laura, because I don't have a job where I have to work with Israelis. I don't work for an Israeli company. I really have no major interaction with them. Like obviously there's a power dynamic because I live in a state where it's a state that is premised on the supremacy of people who are Jewish over people like me who are Palestinian. But I'm fortunate that I don't have that power relationship in a job or like company job, any of those sorts of things, and or education, or even, physician. Like I don't have any of that. And so I'm fortunate enough that I can ask those questions. The reason I was saying I'm a glutton is because I kind of knew what she was going to, I didn't know exactly, but I sort of knew what she was going to say. And I was thinking to myself, do I really want to hear this? Do I really need to hear this? And I chose to ask anyway. But in part because I did want her I wanted her to look at me and say that it was okay. And she did.
Yeah.
That was the main thing, is that she did look at me and say it's okay. And she felt emboldened enough to say that it's okay. Because she is protected in this society. This is a society that's wacko, to put it mildly. Like, I don't even know what words there are to describe it. It's genocidal, but it's beyond genocidal. There's genocidal, but there's maybe I've never been in another genocidal society, but it's genocidal and crazy and insane and scared all at the same time. It's like they've created this world where they're the forever victims. They're forever scared. And that's part of the settler colonial part. So forever victims, forever scared, but then forever powerful.
Yes.
And always in the right.
Yeah.
And that combination means that they can do whatever they want to do to Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've heard them say this. It's a line I repeat over and over again to describe what Israel's about, which is they always say what can't be achieved with force can only be achieved with more force. They say this. So this is kind of this is the ideology that when you're Palestinian, this is what you live with, is the ideology of force and more force and more force, while at the same time, they are genuinely afraid. Because they know that they're in the wrong, and because they look around and they see the relationship that Palestinians have with the land and especially with one another, and it makes them crazy. Yeah, they hate our joy, they hate our laughter, they hate our I don't know if you've ever gone olive picking. Picking olives is it just breaks your back. And it's not fun. I don't care what anybody says. No. It's not fun. All right. It's just not fun. And yet, Palestinians will do everything. Like they have special dishes for it. We sing songs around it. We throw picnics. Like we do everything to make the most difficult. It's not the most difficult, but a difficult task fun. And they hate that. And because they hate that, this is why you see that they'll do everything to uproot the olive trees. This is because they hate that connection that we have to the land. And that connection also brings us joy. And because they don't have that connection to that land and they don't have that joy, so they want to break our joy and they want to break that connection to the land. And so they're genuinely afraid. It's again, it's part of the settler colonial. It's part
totally.
But totally. So it's a weird mix of being here when you see how they feel so emboldened, so strong, and yet so weak at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to hear more about what's happening on the ground in these. I'm really glad you're bringing this in because there's been such a lockdown, right? I mean, there's been so much that Palestinians have put on the line to release and bring out what is actually happening on the ground. Otherwise we'd be in a complete, in the dark, because they have managed to lock this down and threaten their own citizens if they say anything, and like a totally normal democratic state to threaten people with imprisonment if you just mention anything. But one of the things that it's so important what you're saying, because it's such a settler fantasy to think that to attempt to control people's affect would actually be successful in uprooting them from the groundedness of their history and their reality. Only settlers can think like that because they don't have that experience. And it includes a psychic inversion. You're basically describing, Nick Estes talks about this, where like there has to be an inversion about who's the intruder and who's the, native, for somebody to think that you are constantly under attack. I mean, the first time I went to Palestine, the parallels to the United States were so present for me and so stark. And especially as a Lebanese who, like, one time we were on apartheid roads. One time, because when we go there, we take public transportation and sort of commit ourselves to that. But we had a Palestinian comrade who sort of took us, and he lives in Haifa, so he took us on apartheid roads. And as a Lebanese, I was shocked. It's sort of like being in California and being like, these monstrosities of buildings don't belong. Like they don't match. Yeah. There are flags everywhere. Like, boy, if you feel comfortable, you don't need a flag to prove that.
That's exactly what I say.
The only other place I've seen this is the United States, which was shocking to me when I moved here from Lebanon. I was like, if you all feel so secure, like this constant representation, man, you're really fragile in your connection and tetheredness to this space. But I remember walking out the window and seeing a rock and shrubbery that looked exactly like Lebanon. And it hit me so hard there, being like, settlers pass by this and don't see it. Oh. But I see it because Haudi Aradina, these are our lands. Like, yep. I know that shrub, I know that rock, and it was so tiny, but it's kind of like that you're saying is like, these are the untouchable, uncontainable things that they're constantly trying to attack, but can't, because that is a whole other layer of connecting to the space and land, which is why I think also you need to constantly amp up the ferocity, because when your violence isn't landing in the ways that you want it, like they want Palestinians to disappear themselves, right? To just forget, dislodge everything. If that doesn't work, which it hasn't, it has not worked for the hundreds of years that you've been trying, the response will be added ferocity, because not only is there then frustration and then the contradictions in that, but also envy, because you can't fully occupy the position of indigenous no matter how much you try.
You're reminding me of so many little things here. So the first is, I'm going to tell you a story about my mom, and then the second is I'll tell you a story about my friend. So the first story is my mom during COVID. So during COVID, you remember I don't know if anybody still remembers it. Nobody wants to remember, but we all do remember it. So you remember we were supposed to be at home and quarantining at home, staying at home the whole time. And my mother was having none of it. She was having none of it. And she was having none of it because she likes being outdoors, but also it was the season for foraging. And what she was foraging was everything from mushrooms to different greens and all sorts of things. And, we were allowed to be outside. So my mom, when there are some greens here, like za'atar and maramiye and akub. I don't know what akub is in English. Maramiye is sage and za'atar is za'atar. Those three you're not allowed to pick. You're not allowed to harvest or forage because the Israelis are trying to separate Palestinians from the land. And under quote unquote environmental laws, right? Because they care so much about the environment, even though they like bomb Gaza to pieces. Anyway, so my mom was having none of it, and she went out. She was picking everything. She was picking everything that she could see in sight. And a group of Israelis came over and saw her, and they started asking her, like, "What are you picking?" And she told them, and they were so intrigued. Like, what do you do with it? How do you cook it? how? So how many onions do you use? How much oil do you use? How long do you saute it for? She was actually cooking. She was picking khubezi. I don't know what khubezi is in English. And so all of it. So just different types of greens. Oh, and one time she was picking dandelion, elit. And just the number of Israelis who would come over and ask her, so how do you do this? How do you clean it? And this is stuff that is coming from the land. This is not, she's not going to a supermarket and buying it. This is the stuff that is wild, and it's grown wild in Palestine. My mom knows exactly where it grows, exactly what time of year to pick it, exactly what conditions are needed for it to grow. And so the Israelis were shocked. And they were shocked because they will never, ever know. They'll never have that connection. They'll never be able to know when my mom says that it smells like it's raining outside. They'll never know what that means when my mom says it smells like it's raining outside. They'll never understand that. They'll never understand it. And so there was definitely envy there.
Yeah.
And the other story I wanted to tell you is that not only is it that there's envy because they'll never have that connection, but it's also that Palestinians get put under a microscope, as you said, trying to control the affect. So, for example, one of my friends is a physician in one of the hospitals here in Haifa. And she said to me that immediately after October 2023, the doctors were examining her every move to see how she was behaving. So, for example, they would do a collection for the reservists. These are war criminals, and they wanted her to contribute money. And if she didn't, well, they took note of that. Then another time they were bringing in cake to welcome back one of the doctors who had just come back from doing God only knows what in Gaza. And when my friend refused to eat the cake that they had brought for this soldier, again, they would take note. So it was all these like little things, but they somehow didn't take note if it was an Israeli, if an Israeli didn't contribute to the pot, or if an Israeli didn't eat the cake, or if an Israeli didn't, all of those small little things they didn't take note of. But when it's a Palestinian, they definitely take note, and they watch and they observe, and they're just microscopically examining you. That's why I was saying I'm fortunate in the immediate aftermath of like in October of 2023. The number of people I know, number of Palestinians I know who had all their social media trolled and not just trolled, but like gone over with a fine-tooth comb to see whether they had ever posted anything in favor of Palestine, if they'd posted a Palestinian flag, if they'd done anything. It was unbelievable. One of my very, very dear friends is a single mom, and she had posted a picture of her son carrying a Palestinian flag back in April of 2022, April 2022, a year and a half before. And because there was a picture of her little son, who was, I think at the time 4, carrying a picture of her son carrying a picture of a Palestinian flag, she was put on one of these neighborhood watch lists, meaning that she was somebody that the Israelis were going to watch. They put me on a number of watch lists. You know, all the things that happened to me, like tons of things. But it just shows you the levels to which they scrutinize every move that Palestinians make, because they want to be able to control who we are and how we think and how we behave.
Yes. Yes. There will be no joy with the release of political prisoners.
Exactly.
That was another, right? I mean, this is just, it seems heavy-handed, and sometimes people kind of roll their eyes at the absurdity of it. But when you go back to the mechanics and what is needed to continue an entire system that is based on annihilation and elimination, it has to include controlling these everyday, what seem like the mundane, which are the mundane. Like, how do you go from controlling the topography and the infrastructure, and you build up a surveillance technology like the wall, like the roads, like the checkpoints, all these sorts of things, and then slowly move it inward, because those things, despite the fact they make non-contiguous, ghettos and movement is controlled, has yet to infiltrate fully internally. And I don't think it has even to this point, but that's why you need to extend to these places. But one of the, that's racism 101. You're describing racism, like the over surveillance, and it's not noticed. The same thing might not be noticed in somebody else as racism. But the way you're describing this, I just kind of want to highlight it for folks more about the importance of when we talk about normalization. Because I think sometimes we think about normalization as these large things, and they are, and that's why BDS is important, right? Is like, this is not normalizing a genocidal apartheid settler colonial system through divestment and sanctions is one way to engage in non-normalization. Not engaging in projects with people who are, and institutions that are central to the mechanics and the workings of that type of state is another way. But you're describing the everyday relational pieces that I think about when I think about normalization. So had your friend eaten the cake, and this is the piece I really want to get, because sometimes we're like, well, it would be so much easier for me, or this is so small, it's so tefeh, it doesn't matter, whatever. Here's the reason why it matters psychologically, because those relational spaces, like we've been talking about, and I'm so appreciative that we've gotten to this like texture, it relieves. When you engage and you eat that piece of cake, it is not just a piece of cake. It relieves them of the responsibility to actually know and feel, even if they're not feeling, but our position has to remain militant like this, as though it is, to not normalize or let pass how utterly out of the realm of ethics and our ethical imperative to think about a world when you cave to that, because it relieves them of something. They so desperately, going through checkpoints and going through quote-unquote borders teaches you this. They're so desperate for legitimacy. Mm-hmm. And legitimacy happens on a lot of levels, but relationally too. So eating that cake, to me, as you describe it, is a form of normalization. Yes. You're normalizing this engagement. You're normalizing that a reservist would come back as a doctor, and like as though that could be possible in a world, and that he could he or she, because of course women are a part of this genocidal machine too, and vegans, sure, and trans folks, and queer folks, that is an okay position to have, that somehow a doctor could be a genocider one day and then be ethically engaged in the project of doctoring another day.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's totally, but that's what it means to be Palestinian, living in this society, is that these are the micro decisions that you have to take every single day. Yeah. And as I'll always say, I'm the fortunate one. I don't have that burden, because it is a burden. It's a burden. And I often think of my friends who have to sit through that burden or live through that burden every day. And I don't. I deliberately chose not to work with an Israeli company, Israeli universities, or any of that sort of stuff. So I don't have that burden. No.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sort of saying you have privileges, and I understand also what having settler colonial captured citizenship means. You have two,
I have two of them.
at least to be able to move and all that. But one of the things that also folks have described to me is that in some ways how dire the so-called West Bank, or Gaza for sure, or occupied Jerusalem, it takes away from the veneer of confusion. Whereas it was so hard for me to be in Haifa.
Yeah.
Like when we had dinner, and you remember that day and the joyous story that came from that. However, the pointed, targeted, assimilative project, which we see in the settler colonies of so-called Canada and the United States as well, does a certain number on this sort of thing that you're describing, where people, those compromises hide and they start to feel normative, and the coerciveness of living side by side like that, together we will do this. It's furthest most violent extension is in that bumper sticker that you're saying, where you're just like, what does this even mean? But there is a certain level of, I've heard people say this a lot, that like being in a place like Haifa that's sold as like, this is the place of coexistence, right? That, or so-called Tel Aviv, or any one of these things, is like, there's a different configuration of violence that comes with that psychically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So talk about refusal. This is where I refuse. So there's a couple of things I refuse in terms of like who I am. It is so much, this may be surprising to many people, but it's so much easier to live in Ramallah than it is in Haifa. Why? Ramallah, when you're inside the city, then it's relatively easy. It functions. It's what many of us refer to as the 5-star occupation or the bubble or whatever. Meaning that you're in there, you don't see Hebrew, you don't see soldiers, you don't see settlers, you're surrounded by people who speak the same language, who for the most part think the same, who are from the land at least, and it feels very normal. In fact, the place I felt the most normal and the safest was Gaza. When I lived in Gaza in 2005, 2006, that to me was the place I felt the most free, was Gaza, because I didn't have the army around me. I didn't have any of that stuff around me. And so I felt the most free. So in Ramallah, in a weird way, you feel the most free when you're within the city. Step outside the city or try to like leave the city, and that's where you feel the full weight of the occupation. You also feel it when you're living there, when the army raids and when they do things like cut the electricity and those sorts of things. I don't want to paint it as beautiful roses. It's not. But in terms of structurally, in terms of like day-to-day life, it's so much easier to live in Ramallah. So many of my friends have moved to Ramallah because it's just that much easier. They don't have to worry. They don't have to think about having to make those day-to-day decisions that you and I just talked about if they live in Haifa. So the day-to-day decisions of like, do I take the cake? Do I not take the cake? Do I contribute to the fund? Do I not? Like those are decisions that you don't have to even think about. Those are issues you don't have to think about living in Ramallah or in Nablus or any of those places. And so I always say this is exactly what the Israelis want. They want us to leave Haifa. They want us to leave Nazareth. They want us to leave Jaffa. They want us to leave Lid. They want us to leave all these places and move to Ramallah or whatever, because that is their logic. They want as many Palestinians as possible in as tiny a space as possible. And so I refuse. And what that means is that even though the schools are probably better in Ramallah, I refuse. I refuse to leave 48. I insist on living in 48. I insist that my son go to a public school in Haifa, because I want them. And there's a lot. Most Palestinians go to private schools in Haifa because there's such a classroom shortage. But I insist. Why? Because I insist on them seeing that there are people who are demanding Arabic language. I insist on them seeing that there are people who aren't going to just easily give up and move away. I insist on them hearing the Arabic language spoken in the middle of the street. I insist on them seeing women wearing hijab, or people wearing crosses. Like I insist on that. Because otherwise it makes them feel like, oh, this is just lovely and nice. And the way it is right now is that Palestinians are just a decoration for them. Palestinians are the ones who make the great food. They have the wonderful restaurants in the German colony in Haifa. But it's only when people are refusing to leave and making it so that the Israelis recognize that this is actually a Palestinian city, that's when I think that it makes them feel uncomfortable and brings to light the idea of settler colonialism, that they are settlers and that they are not, this isn't, that this isn't, their presence isn't normal. It's interesting because where I live in Haifa, the minute I turn on the radio in the car, the station that I pick up, the first station that picks up is a Southern Lebanese station. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I want them to be hearing that because I want them to recognize that they are the foreigners. They're the entity that shouldn't be here. It's the hearing Lebanese accented Arabic is so natural for me. I wish I could go to Lebanon. And that's the fact that I can't go is the part that is absurd. And that's what I want the Israelis to recognize. And the second thing that on the part of refusal is the other thing that the Israelis have done is that because they've created so many checkpoints and roadblocks and barriers, and they made it practically impossible for Palestinians to be part of the land that they are from. I'm one of the privileged ones. I was born in a different place, and I've seen more of Palestine than most Palestinians have seen. I've lived in Gaza. I've lived in Nazareth. I've lived in Haifa. I lived in Jerusalem. I lived in Ramallah. That's far more than most Palestinians. And people ask me all the time, and this is the part that kills me, is that people ask me all the time, what does such and such a place look like? People from Jenin always ask me, what does Al-Aqsa look like? People from Ramallah ask me, what does Gaza look like? People from Gaza all the time, what does Nablus look like? What does Al-Aqsa look like? Remember one guy from Nablus said, what does the sea smell like? And so one of the things that I refuse to do is I refuse to stay in the bubble of just staying in Haifa, or I refuse to stay in the bubble of just staying in Ramallah. I insist on traveling around my country because it is my country. And I refuse to just be thrown behind some barriers, and to live in fear from that. Most Palestinians cannot travel. They don't have that luxury. They don't have that privilege because the Israelis don't give them permission to travel within their own country. And so because I have that privilege, I use it. And I insist on using it, and I refuse to cave into their rules.
Yeah. So powerful what you're saying now. It's powerful emotionally because the impact is there, right? The hearing somebody ask about what the sea smells like. I mean, it just talk about bringing in the personal and why the psychic meltdown happens, because you're immediately in the space of like, that question comes from a place of deprivation, and that deprivation is insisted upon by a state that's cruel and violent and restricts that movement on purpose because they're Palestinian. Yeah. There's no other reason, right? But also because I think...
Oh, sorry. I think this is... Hold on just 1 second. This part you're going to need to... All right. I think it went off.
You're good?
Yes, I think so.
Tina can get that. Part of why it's also really powerful is you are describing what it means. And I think sometimes we think about this just theoretically, or it becomes a meme or a statement or something like that about what presence means. Yeah. And how in and of itself it can be disruptive in the best of ways. Like, what does it mean for us to disrupt the workings of settler colonialism or power or oppressive systems in a way in which they are not allowed, we will not let them just keep on going without any contestation. Yeah. And that can look like a lot of different things, but for you, for your particular configuration, this is why I appreciate you bringing in like that. That's contingent on some things, that contingent on settler colonial citizenship, that's contingent on sometimes class privilege, movement, all the things that constrict sometimes. But if those things are in place, what does it mean to actually commit to the political project of disruption when we understand that it is disruptive? Like, this wouldn't work if it weren't disruptive. But you and I, what we're describing is like your mere presence in these spaces. When we were traveling from Haifa to Al-Quds using public transportation, sitting in that bus station with the settler soldiers and their guns just out, like this
and
one.
it's
I have this
terrifying.
photo.
And it can be terrifying.
Horrid.
Yeah.
Totally. It's horrid. And just the disrupting the normativity of that, because for them, this is just a normal part of life. Oh, I'm just walking around. I'm a settler soldier. I'm holding this fucking machine gun and, walking around. I have this photo of this one soldier, a woman, taking a selfie of herself with her gun across her lap in this bus station, right? But us being there, and at the time, I think we were wearing hatat, and just the look, just disrupting. And we understand that wasn't a light decision.
No.
It wasn't a decision of being like, oh, we're just going to be like grandiose and walk around with hatat. It was like, we understand who's not allowed to wear this. And if this settler citizenship that Stephen and I both carry is worth anything, it's risking this. And what's the risk? Like, in the end, should I see it? I'm never going to be allowed back in. And that would be heartbreaking. But in the realm of things, that's nothing. But it is a reminder to them that you don't just get to live. We talk about our bubble, their bubble. Like, that bubble needs to consistently be pushed upon, burst. And that's why the repetition is so important. Is also part of what you were saying is that I've heard this version of this before, of it's easier to live in Ramallah, it's easier. And I get that, because you're not confused about who's doing the violence.
Yeah.
Like, you understand who circumscribes your life as well. And then you find ways to persist and exist despite that.
Yeah.
Which is a magical way of sort of committing to life still, despite that. But that's why when we hear what's happening right now, when we hear about the raids, when we hear about the 3,000 checkpoints, when we hear about locking, villages where people can't move in and out, when we hear about the raids on Jenin, when we hear about kidnapping, I want people to get how different of a reality this is right now. Like, how different it actually is when you're talking about the so-called West Bank and all the machinery of violence that right now is being enacted. This is a different, I think there's a way in which we can say and say that this has been a slow genocidal project since inception. Of course it has. And also be like, this is a whole different level right now.
We're totally at a whole different level. Completely. Sometimes I even lack the words to describe it.
Yeah.
Because it's so, it's beyond even something I could imagine.
Yeah.
I've read so many science fiction books, and this is beyond anything that I've ever even read in a science fiction book, because it's science fiction coupled with death technology. Yeah. And I used to, in the past, when I used to translate for journalists, I remember always saying to my friends, well, Palestinians always say the same thing. Oh, the situation is difficult. The situation is difficult. The situation is difficult. And they don't describe what is so difficult. And I later realized that the reason that it's so difficult to describe is because this is beyond what the human condition should be experiencing and bearing. And because of that, sometimes we even lack the words. So I'm going to try. And I'm going to try by focusing on just a few places I've been to recently. So the first one is Tul Kerem. Tul Kerem is right in the center part of the West Bank. And there are a few refugee camps there. The Israelis have now destroyed the Nur Shams refugee camp as well as the Tul Kerem refugee camp. And with no prospects ever of people going back. The reason that they've done so is because they can. It's really that simple, because they can. And because the Israelis have committed to this idea that there are no Palestinian refugees. And so they're going to wipe out anything that has to do with Palestinian refugees. So they don't want any symbols of UNRWA and so on. But what does that mean on the ground? It means that between Tul Kerem and Jenin, the two major refugee camps, 32,000 Palestinians have been made homeless. And these are families that have been turned twice into refugees, for 1948 and against in 1967. And now in 2023 to 2025 have been made completely homeless. Some of these families are living in mosques. Some of them are living with other family members. But you're really talking about the destruction of entire communities that have just been erased off the map. Some women, some Palestinian women, have tried to go back to the camps to pick up some things from the houses, because many of them were given like orders of less than 24 hours. And even though some of them got permission, they were killed. Sometimes young boys are riding bicycles in the area. They've been gunned down. Just the other day, we learned that the Israelis they're obsessed with colors, by the way. They have a yellow line in Gaza. There's a yellow line now in Tul Kerem. And just like the yellow line that exists in Gaza, where it's some, magical yellow line that nobody knows where it exists. And if you cross that yellow line, you can get killed. The same thing exists now in Tul Kerem. And so people who cross this yellow line where we don't know where it exists have been gunned down. They've been used sometimes, I feel like they're sometimes target practice by the Israeli soldiers. Then the second area that I want to describe is actually a family. It's an American family, Palestinian American family. And the only reason I'm describing this person as American is because they thought that their American citizenship would help them, but it hasn't. And so it's the story of a young man named Saifullah Musallat, 20 years old. He came to he spent half of his life just outside of Ramallah, half of his life in Florida. He owned a little ice cream shop in Tampa, in Florida. And his family has owned land just outside of Ramallah in a place called Mazra'ah for centuries, for a long time. And the Israelis have been slowly encroaching on this land. They've tried all sorts of means, including everything from declaring it archaeological sites, you name it. And most recently, what Israeli settlers did was that they parked themselves right on the land of this family, the Musallat family. And Saif, along with his two cousins, went down to try to get these settlers off of the land. Instead, Saif and a friend were beaten to death by the settlers. The Israeli settlers prevented ambulances. They prevented an Israeli ambulance from getting there. And then the army prevented a Palestinian ambulance from getting there. And so he unfortunately bled to death. When the family found him, and I hope the family's not listening to this, they found him with a sock shoved into his mouth. All right, and his head bashed in. The things that they had done to this boy were beyond cruel. And then, of course, it was Shabbat, so they had to stop, and then they went to do their Shabbat prayers. The family has been waiting for some form of justice since July. And Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador, has come to the House and said, of course they're going to get justice, but they've done nothing. And not only that, the family still can't access their land. After all of this, the family still can't access their land. In addition, Saif's own cousin, 4 months before Saif was killed, his cousin, who at the age of 15 was picked up and thrown into Israeli prison for quote unquote stone throwing, no evidence whatsoever. And he was held in prison for 9 months, starved. The kid came out at the age of 16 with scabies and having lost 66 pounds from February until November, when he was finally released. And those are just those are just a couple of stories. But then in the West Bank, you've got settlers that have been attacking Palestinians daily. You've got soldiers that have been attacking Palestinians daily. Over 1,000 Palestinians killed over the course of the past 2 years. 13 Palestinian towns, in addition to the refugee camps, totally wiped off the map. 2 Palestinian towns that have been completely surrounded by barbed wire. Like, you look at it and it looks like something out of World War II. It's like 8-meter high barbed wire surrounding Palestinian towns. The Israelis have cut off money to the Palestinian Authority, which means they've cut off money to go to teachers, to hospitals, to doctors, to you name it. People have been people making decisions as to whether they should be buying food or buying their blood pressure medication. They haven't received full salaries. Employees of the Palestinian Authority haven't received full salaries in 4 years. The last partial salary that they got was back in August. So you're really seeing people who are on the verge of breaking. And that's exactly what the Israelis want. The Palestinian prisoners who are for every prisoner that was released, an estimated 5 were picked up. Just so that you can understand the ratio. There are now 10,000 Palestinians just from the West Bank alone who are being held in prisons. Half of them without, one third of them without charge or trial. The other third have been charged, but without trial. That means 2/3 are being held without having ever been tried for anything. And there's an additional 1,200 that we know of. There's many that we don't know of that are being held as what they call unlawful combatants, the same status that was used for Guantanamo Bay. Also being tortured, also being starved to death. These include doctors, they include journalists, they include lawyers, they at one point included an older woman who was 71 years old who was kidnapped from her bed in Gaza. The things that Israel's been allowed to do is unbelievable. And it's just all gone under the radar. And a lot of the part that we hear a little bit about the West Bank, but the part that we don't hear anything about is what's happening in the prisons. And that for me is because it's all behind closed doors. We know that every single prisoner has been tortured. We know that every single one of them has been starved. We know that many of them have been raped and had sexual violence, or subject to sexual violence. And there's just no end in sight. They haven't been able to see lawyers. They haven't been able to see doctors. I know people personally whose ribs and whose other body parts were broken and were told that if they complained, that they just might not ever appear anywhere. What's happening is just horrifying, and it's completely being, it's not being reported on. It's only being reported on by Palestinians. And I don't know what more to say. Like, I can talk more about international media, but all to say that I'm so grateful for Palestinian journalists who continue to insist to bring stories out. And I'm so grateful for people who are living through this brutal, horrible, violent regime, and who, despite it all, continue to speak out because they want the world to know what's happening to them.
That's right. I mean, I include you in that. I know you've noted the differing privileges, but we've also talked about the price that one pays. And I think that you and I both can agree that there's no price that matches, number one, the cause that we're fighting for. Number two, in the face of this torture that you're describing, systematic, ongoing, purposeful, targeted. I think that's why we speak. And if nothing else, what I hope is the provocation is like, this is precisely what we're talking about when we talk about the commitment to the risks that are involved in fighting for the liberation of Palestine, wherever you may be. I mean, I'm thinking here about the folks who are on hunger strike in the UK, who are also being systematically starved, and that like that carceral logic extends and learns from each other. It's not, there's a different configuration in the context of Palestine. And also it's the same logic of elimination and a targeting of anybody that disrupts, dissenters, people who remind the settler that somehow they're not native to the land. It expands so much to include that I think this is the part, like what I want to translate is anytime folks feel like speaking is not enough, this is why you have to continue to tell these stories. This is why you must name exactly what's happening. This is why we have to continuously repeat from the small things to the big things that are happening, because that lockdown that you're talking about is also purposeful. Like you said, the gratitude I feel like, I mean, I just need to go onto my feed, and I'm somebody who's like really clued in and locked in, and I go searching for things. And the ways in which it's been whittled down, and like if you don't have either Hebrew news or Arabic news, there's barely anything.
There's nothing
out there. And I think that's the cahoots we're talking about. So what does it mean for us not to feel like these are small gestures in the face of this, when we have folks who are actually entrusting us with that? Like political prisoners, when you listen to them, especially in Arabic, what they're saying is that like, I'm out, it's my responsibility to let out what is actually happening. And I think this is the shift we're seeing, where men are also talking about sexual abuse and sexual assault in a way that we haven't seen before. And it's our responsibility to radically redistribute the ways in which we hold them, because it's not meant to be easy to talk about these things. They're purposefully humiliating. They're purposefully meant to have somebody feel undignified. They're purposely meant to actually disrupt kinship and relational space, because whether that's internalized shame or the shame that's sort of societally based. And so you're just bringing home for us why we need to really take seriously the radical redistribution of responsibility around these things, whether it's uplifting the voices or like just continuously telling the truth and unpacking exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I really am so grateful to everybody who's been speaking out, but especially Palestinians. Because it really does take from you a lot. I mean, you know this, right? It takes from you to have to be recounting over and over and over again. And I don't talk about what's happened to me because I find it small. And then also I think, oh, because it's small, it's not worth it. And then also because it's small, I don't want the Israelis to think they got the better of me. You know, it's all these things. We go through a lot of these things. We all go through this. And then I see so many, and because I meet so many people and I speak to so many people who they do share. And, you know, and it's not just like, what the Israelis are doing now to men in particular, I would even describe it as sexual torture. It's not even like, it's the whole point of it is to torture them. And it's not just the point of humiliation. It's even beyond that at this point. And the Israelis take a lot of joy in it. This is the weird. I mean, they had people who were rioting in order to be for their right to do that. You know, for their right to do that.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think about all the things that we just don't know about, because this is the tip of the iceberg. The number of stories that I've been able to uncover over the course of the past 2 years are, I think, just the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that have actually happened. I've heard, I know I have friends who have told me about how they've been used as as human shields and put down into tunnels in Gaza. And the reason was that they wanted to spare the dogs. They understood the Israelis saying that we want to spare the dogs. We've tracked how there's a whole pipeline of dogs that are coming from Germany and from other places that are specifically designed to torture Palestinians. There's just all of these ways in which people have been open about what has happened to them and what is happening around them. And it comes at a very heavy cost because they will probably be targeted again. Mm-hmm. Or as you know, it's sometimes it can be hard to retell it over and over and over again.
Absolutely. Yeah. All the more reason for us not to let down and continue pushing at the seams. It's coming undone. I mean, it's coming undone. The difficulty is that it comes, like you're saying, the violence also exponentially increases when something's flailing, coming undone, losing everything, losing its positionality. And that's also hard for us to hold on to.
Yes.
Like in the face of all this, to be like, this is a symptom of an entire ideology and structure coming undone at the seams. There is no going back.
No, there's no going back.
The global majority knows Israel for what it is, knows Zionism for what it is. The global majority. And I think that's something for us to really hold on to.
Absolutely.
Diana, I could talk to you all day long, but I want to give you back. Is there anything you want to end on? Is there anything you want folks to just hold on to, be militant about, remember?
You started off by saying something about to be a Zionist, you have to kind of suspend reality, right? You have to live in a different reality. And it's so true. And the flip side of that is that to be Palestinian is you have to do the same, which is that for me, I mean, maybe not others, but for me, I have to wake up every morning, or when I wake up every morning, I have to think of what Palestine looks like when it's free. Because otherwise, if I think about it in the way that it is today, it really can eat you. That's what it's designed to do. Like they want you to be consumed by it so that you do eat that piece of cake, right? And the only way that I and so many others can refuse to eat that piece of cake is to keep thinking about what is Palestine going to look like when it's free. And it's something I wake up every single day and imagine.
I love that. And I'll come meet you from Bab al-Fatmi, from Lebanon to Palestine. يعطيك ألف عافية.